This is spring quarter 2023, and you are tuned in to History 72B. In the last set of lectures, we looked at how the white suburban nuclear family came to be a hegemonic ideal in the wake of World War II. In this package, we'll be looking beyond and around the happy families ideal. In this lecture, I'm going to start big and look at how the American nuclear family and the containment of women's sexuality served international political goals for the U.S. as the Cold War became a way of life. Then I'll be looking at teenage mothers as an example of how some of the most vulnerable in society were made to serve the nuclear family ideal, despite the realities of their lives. The world changed drastically for Americans in the wake of World War II. How could it not? But just as with the changes of industrialization a century earlier, these changes made Americans with some power feel uneasy and worried about losing the privileges that they had. We've seen the control of women's sexuality used as a way to protect power and control society before, for example, with the Comstock Act and raids on birth control clinics in the early 20th century. And if you watch the coda to the nuclear family lecture, then you know that the sexuality of women, especially middle-class white women, was considered something destructive when not contained in marriage. The international situation of the United States at the time is not a bad metaphor for domestic power relations. Fear of losing power was as potent a motivator as the desire for more power. The U.S. had become a world superpower, along with the Soviet Union, and both countries were trying to protect the power that they had by fighting small wars in less powerful countries to control trade and diplomatic relations. The physical fight did not take place directly between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, because both sides had phenomenally powerful nuclear weapons, which, if used, would destroy not only the two superpowers, but all allied countries as well. So, in addition to proxy wars, the U.S. and Soviet Union also engaged in international exchanges of boasts and bravado. One of the most visible examples of verbal sparring came in 1959 between then Vice President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. The occasion was the opening of the American National Exhibition in Moscow, showing American inventions for the home, washing machines, oven ranges, and the like. Because of this, the international argument is often called the kitchen debate, but it really boiled down to which country had better women. Before I quote parts of the debate, I want to draw your attention to the crowd of press, translators, and diplomats, and note what is missing: women. The group debating the merits of women's lives was made up entirely of men. And now, in the words of Nixon and Khrushchev, Nixon said, "In America, these washing machines are designed to make things easier for our women." Khrushchev replied, "In this country, we do not have that capitalist attitude toward women," meaning that Soviet women were not confined to homes. Nixon, oblivious, deliberately or not, to Khrushchev's point, basically said that a measure of quality of life centered on the existence of homebound women, responding, quote, "I think this attitude toward women is universal. What we want is to make easier the life of our housewives." The possessive "our women, our housewives" is telling, but so is the assumption on Nixon's part that woman meant white suburban housewife, as if there were no other possibility, much less the reality of the American women who were not white or middle class or housewives. This lecture is about one aspect of the domestic policy side of this containment definition of the American woman, and what it meant for the racialized control of women's reproductive lives when they broke the rules and had sex outside of marriage. Author Ricky Solinger has explained, in the decades after World War II, many American politicians and policymakers resisted massive and effective human rights movements, including movements demanding racial equality and gender equality, and movements defining a concept of welfare rights. For many government officials and ordinary Americans, the issue of illegitimacy, unmarried pregnancy, childbearing, and motherhood, became the crux symbol of what was disruptive, dangerous, and downright wrong about the claims of these overlapping liberation movements. Solinger has documented the way that the vilification of so-called unwed mothers, while universal and generally devastating, universal within the United States, and generally devastating for the young women involved, became racialized in a way that transformed the social safety net into a method to justify and entrench racial segregation. I am going to start with Solinger's big picture here and then move in to illustrate the parts more clearly. I've set us up, I hope, to recognize control of family structure and reproduction as a gendered form of social control. The first step here had precedent in pre-World War II racialized sexism, but took on a very particular form in the context of Cold War America and the construction of unwed motherhood as a social ill. After World War II, politicians, policymakers, service providers, and various community authorities routinely used a language of value that distinguished white unmarried mothers and their newly commodified babies from their valueless Black counterparts, and that valueless is in quotes. Politicians, service providers, and the media, along with a number of academics, mostly sociologists and psychologists, developed race-specific theories to explain why unwed mothers were not real mothers. Public policy experts and social service providers developed racially specific vehicles for redistributing white illegitimate children, that is, removing infants from the care of biological mothers, newly defined as illegitimate mothers, and handing these babies over to higher income, married white people to raise. These same authority figures used the welfare system to publicly shame and financially punish unwed mothers of color and their children, using illegitimacy combined with race to enforce a segregated social system. Now that we have the big shape of things, let's look more closely at the two tracks for unwed mothers in the first half of the Cold War. We will start with Sally's story. In 1957, at the age of 16, Sally, who lived in a middle-class suburb, discovered that she was pregnant. The baby's father lost interest in her immediately, as she was no longer the wholesome, innocent girl who had initially attracted him, never mind his own role in that. Sally's parents were horrified and angry, although particularly in her father's case, more out of concern for himself than for her. Sally's father, a well-respected businessman with deep roots in the community, was bitterly obsessed with what the neighbors in the community and their friends at church would say. Sally's mother worried that no one would ever marry her ruined daughter. Sally's father proposed to send Sally away permanently and tell everyone that she had died. Sally's mother booked her a place at a home for unwed mothers and informed Sally's school and the rest of the town that Sally was spending the semester with relatives in San Diego. Sally spent 6 weeks locked at home with parents who alternately berated her and would not speak to her. And as soon as she started to show, she was packed away to the Florence Crittenton home in Philadelphia. At the maternity home, Sally was put in classes on good grooming, sewing, cooking, and charm. When at first she said that she wanted to keep her baby, the social worker assigned to her diagnosed Sally as borderline schizophrenic with homosexual and masochistic tendencies. And they, the social worker, worked with Sally on a weekly basis. Sally's baby boy was given in adoption to an affluent couple, and Sally was quoted as saying, "I don't think any unmarried girl has the right to keep her baby. I don't think it's fair to the child. I know that I don't have that right. Sally returned home, instructed never to reveal her same shameful secret, an injunction that she followed for most of her life. To everyone else, Sally's child had never existed, but her baby continued to be real for Sally. Sally's treatment reflected a change in ideas and explanations of white single motherhood from the period before World War II. Prior to the 20th century, an unmarried white pregnant girl whose family rejected her would seek help from an evangelical rescue or maternity home. These were usually located in cities and staffed by sternly religious matrons. Maternity homes sought to prepare ruined girls and women for lives as service workers and outcast but caring mothers. They kept their children. If the girl had been born to the middle class, she fell to the lowest order of the working class. Three major interrelated shifts led to a change in the treatment of middle-class unwed teen mothers. First, annual rates of white unwed motherhood began a steady increase in the mid-1940s that continued through the 1950s despite the condemnation. The white middle class was also growing, as we have seen. There just wasn't room to sequester, punish, and insist on the permanent ruination of ever-growing numbers of white middle class girls. Secondly, the maternity homes themselves changed. They began to phase out religious staff and replace them with professional social workers. These homes also began to be partially funded by contributions from the white communities they served. It was good business practice to offer white middle-class parents a route for their daughter beyond illegal abortion, black market adoption, or ruinous motherhood. Thirdly, the ideological context in which illegitimacy occurred changed dramatically during the war. In the 1920s, unwed mothers were assumed to be intellectually inferior but sexually precocious due to a substandard home environment. We've seen the 3 generations of imbeciles attitude before when it came to legal sterilization of poor white women who had children out of wedlock. By the mid-1940s, however, the unwed white teen mom was assessed using neo-Freudian psychological view that the girl was suffering from an individual but treatable form of neurosis. We saw this in the assessment of Sally by the social worker. Meanwhile, the middle-class white family with several children had become an ideal, creating a legal market for white babies in homes with no or too few children. At the same time, as Salinger has described, the emphasis on the nuclear family led to a new definition of white motherhood, that it could not be achieved without a husband outside of a properly constructed family, as post-war womanhood could not be achieved without a man. Both constructs insisted on the centrality of the male to female adult roles, an idea that offset the post-war concern that women were aggressively undermining male prerogatives in the United States. White middle-class girls and young women were to be convinced that it was simply impossible for them to be mothers and that their children should be given to others to raise. They were then expected to go back to their lives as if nothing had happened. Like Sally, Brenda became pregnant in 1957 at the age of 16. But unlike Sally, Brenda lived in an urban neighborhood that was effectively segregated. Brenda's mother recognized the signs of pregnancy and was upset, but more concerned than angry, and her concerns were not misplaced. As soon as Brenda started to show, she was called into the Dean of Girls' office at school, expelled, and told not to come back, ever. The father of Brenda's baby hung around, but as she got bigger, he came around less. At 7 months, Brenda was able to get her first prenatal exam. By the time Brenda had her baby, the father had left the state looking for work. Brenda went to the welfare office. There, she was basically slut-shamed, told she needed to find the baby's father if she wanted assistance, but also given paperwork, and told that girls who had another child were kicked off welfare. Finally, for good measure, the welfare employees said that so-called repeat offenders should be jailed or sterilized. Brenda said of her child, "I love the baby as much as if I was married." Brenda continued to live with her mother and older sister, who shared in the care of both Brenda and her child. Prior to World War II, the only place a pregnant unwed Black teen could turn for help was to her family. Maternity homes would not accept Black women, and white policymakers, taxpayers, and social service professionals entirely ignored the Black population, as if they simply did not count as Americans. Fortunately for the girls, as Solinger notes, Black families and communities did not typically require each other to expel their unmarried pregnant daughters, as white families and communities did. What white observers and scholars did note was both the self-sufficiency of Black mothers and close mother-daughter bonds. Sociologists and the media defined this as a type of matriarchy, and rather than admiring resourcefulness in the face of adversity, they decided that the mother, and not adversity and racism, were to blame for everything from poverty to underfunded schools. During the 1940s, aid from public money became available to unmarried mothers and their children through the Aid to Dependent Children program. Poor white and Black families benefited from this program, but only the Black mothers attracted the degree of attention of the white middle class, who felt that their taxes funded the program, and why should they have to pay for others? Several trends joined together to make life more difficult for Black than white aid recipients. First, the middle class resented the idea of helping the poor at all. The eugenics idea that the poor were somehow to blame for poverty was used as an excuse for why the middle class was virtuous, but the poor were responsible for poverty. Second, the civil rights movement gained momentum and attention, and it gained resentment among large parts of the white middle class. Remember, too, the legacy of respectability politics to parts of the civil rights movement. Pregnant Black teens were a vulnerable population that everyone used as a scapegoat. And third, the emphasis on the father in the hegemonic patriarchal nuclear family ideal of the 1950s meant that the self-sufficiency of Black women appeared as a threat to white male policymakers and commentators. A family system that was perfectly valid was cast as pathological, because how could any woman survive without a man? And the Black family, especially if it included young mothers, was cast as the root of all social evils. To quote Solinger once more, "For white politicians, taxpayers, and social analysts, Black woman-centered families became bearers of syndromes for which white society could not be blamed and for which it should not be forced to assume responsibility." And I have added, how convenient, now that the white middle class had gotten a boost from the GI Bill and other public policy interventions and help. We will see this same vilification of Black women and families as a through line over the course of the 20th century. Key points for Lecture 21 in Package G. The 1950s emphasis on the male breadwinner nuclear family meant that single mothers were a threat to systems of power. Young single mothers, now dubbed unwed, were a vulnerable group regardless of race. Remember, the meaning of age is socially constructed along with other categories, and these girls were vulnerable because of the intersection of age and sex. White middle-class unwed mothers in the 1950s were expected to go away to have their babies, give their babies up for adoption, and then return to their town and pick up as if the baby had never existed. No one outside of the nuclear family could know, because it would bring shame on the male head of household. Although aid to dependent children helped all groups in America, Black single mothers became the scapegoat for all of American society's problems, including poverty. Rather than being recognized for their resourcefulness, Black woman-headed households were vilified by policymakers, commentators, and social scientists. The coda for this lecture is 1950s advertisements for TV. I want you to notice who is the assumed audience or consumer for these advertisements. How are families represented? How are women dressed and positioned in the ads? In the first type of TV ad, the white middle-class family is gathered around the TV. Dad is almost always in an armchair with the children clustered around him, and everyone is dressed presentably, as if people might drop in and judge them at any moment. In this one, Mom, in dress and presumably heels, is busy looking to the needs of her family. Mom doesn't appear in this one at all. The dad is watching sports with his children while Mom is assumed to be busy in the kitchen. Here, Mom, in a dress, is hurrying her son inside so that he doesn't miss out on watching sports with Dad. And this one is radical. Mom and Dad are actually seated next to one another on the couch. Here we have the pretty white woman in evening clothes suggesting that the television is a similarly beautiful object to acquire. Again, she's not watching the TV here and deriving enjoyment from it herself, but displaying it as she does her stylish evening ensemble. And this one makes the analogy of beautiful woman in television explicit, with the word beauties written in a font as large as the brand name. In this one, the analogy of desirable object is clear, as the women aren't even interacting with the TV. And I am going to leave this one with its idea of control to you to take apart. And finally, we have the television as babysitter. This woman looks a bit possessed. You will watch television and let me clean the house in peace. You will. Eating with television? Drawing on the television. Not sure how thrilled Mom will be about that. Television as the best thing ever in your son's life. And why television is actually good for your children. And TVs can be used to babysit both children and husband to keep them all out of your hair so that you can cook and clean.